So my track record, I worked at Wright Organic Gardens as head of information and training for 6 years. This was some number of years ago, but anyway, and now I work freelance, so I still do a bit of work. And I give talks to gardening groups, which is where these talks have come from. So, so the talk we're having tonight, called "There Are No Garden Pests." So it's been written really, as it were, if I was standing in front of an audience as a garden club. So, so forgive me if it doesn't quite fit the bill, but I'm sure it'll be fine. So the talk I originally wrote to sort of shock people, I suppose, to just make people think twice. You know, why are we calling these things pests, for one thing? Obviously here I'm addressing a wildlife gardening group, so I'm sure you're not particularly into squashing things just for the hell of it, but as gardeners, you know, we do sort of regard the plants in the garden as precious. And you know, when we get attacks from caterpillars and aphids and all sorts of other creatures in the garden, it can be very easy to just reach for the easy solution and zap them with something, or assume that they're basically doing harm. So hopefully through the talk, I'll talk you through different sorts of pests, perhaps some solutions to them, but also what I really hope to do is to persuade you that things aren't a pest. So first of all, what is a pest? I mean, the problem is that word, isn't it, really? The word pest altogether suggests that these things have no use whatever in the garden. And so the Oxford English Dictionary defines a pest as any organism that damages crops or injures or irritates livestock or man. So it's a completely objectified sort of statement, really, assuming that we don't want these things in the garden. So the picture there, the little bug there, is actually a vine weevil. And although they look a bit exotic, they are a native species. Interestingly, vine weevils are, well, 99% female, and that means that they actually don't need males to fertilize them. They just go around laying eggs, and the eggs are viable, and so they can lay an enormous amount of eggs and expand their numbers very rapidly. And that is something that really a lot of pests are able to do. And there's a reason for that, obviously. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So first of all, let's just have a look at, well, this was the Royal Horticultural Society, RHS. Every year they give out a top 10 of so-called garden pests. So you can change whichever's at number one. It varies each year, but you know. So I've got viburnum beetle, and that's the one that causes the kind of lacy effect on viburnum bushes, if you've got one. Slugs and snails, I'm sure we're all very familiar with. There's one called cushion scale. There's chafer grubs in lawns, harlequin ladybirds. They are a bit of a foreign invasive species, actually. Vine weevil, there's lily beetle, which is another one which has crept over to the UK from foreign climes. Horse chestnut scale, there's glasshouse red spider mite, and ants. So you can add to that list whatever you like, but those are some common ones. So top right, the bright red one, that's a lily beetle. The picture of the holly, that's actually a scale insect on the back there. And then there's harlequin beetles, there's a chafer, and some vine weevil grubs. So let's have a look. So really, the thing about pests is, what we really ought to learn about in our garden is, well, information. So rather than just squishing anything that comes along and you assume it's damaging, is actually identify it, find out what it is. So first question, is it is it causing any damage, and is it something you should worry about, and is it something you should even attempt to kill? Hopefully not. So let's look at the very common ones. These are slugs and snails. And the thing about slugs and snails is they are hermaphrodite, which basically means they are kind of both male and female. They do a little bit of an exchange on a damp evening, and so their eggs are fertilized, but you know, either can lay the eggs, and they lay them in batches of 10 to 50 and up to 500 in the soil. And of course they feed on seedlings, young growth, plants under stress, and generally things with a high nitrogen content in the leaf. But of course they don't actually eat everything in the garden. So let's have a look. So on average, a UK garden is home to over 20,000 slugs. It's estimated that an acre of farmland can support over 250,000 slugs. Most live underground, and the ones that can be seen feeding above ground are only approximately 5% of the total slug population. So the general advice of going out with a bucket and collecting them is probably not going to get rid of the problem, certainly. And as we'll see, there's some much more efficient ways of controlling slugs, which are basically other wildlife. So there's 30 species of slugs in the UK, 4 that are classed as pests. And the actual pest species are the netted or grey field slug, the garden slug, the keeled slug, and the large black slug. And one that's been getting a bit of press is the Spanish slug. So as you can see from that, really, it's not all slugs that are actually pests. And there are some that certainly don't even feed on plants and cause any damage. So there we go. So learn about their habits, habitat, and their breeding cycles is a good plan. And which species are the problem? We'll have a look at that. Have a look at the some that aren't. And also, there's a lot of things we do in gardening that in a way actually cause a problem in itself. So there's a picture there of some nice looking petunias, which people go to the garden centre, pay a fair bit of money for, put in the garden, and then sprinkle slug pellets around in order to stop the slugs eating them. So I would ask the question really, why are you planting these things in the first place if they're so tempting to slugs, and that you then actually need to put some poison down to stop them being eaten? So let's have a look. So here's 2 harmless slugs. There's the leopard slug and the yellow slug. And both of these actually more likely to live in your compost heap and not be eating lettuces. And they are carnivorous to other species of slugs as well. So that's left alone and put them in your compost heap. They're quite happy there. So, of course, the other option, rather than actually putting in plants that are vulnerable to slugs, there's lots and lots of plants that are fairly trouble-free in terms of slugs and snails. And from a wildlife perspective, if they've got flowers on, they're good for pollen, for bees, and for other nectar-feeding creatures. So there's a little list there: Agapanthus, Aquilegia, Alchemilla, Digitalis, hardy geranium, nasturtium, fuchsia, sedum spectabile, which is the ice plant, and verbascum. I don't know if I can I use my pointer on this? Can you see what I'm pointing at? Oh, okay, good. Right, so that one's verbascum. This is hardy geranium, and these are Aquilegia, and that's Agapanthus. So just so you know on there. Okay. All right. But of course, what we're really, really interested in is nature's way of looking after the garden. So there's a whole list of things that are predators of slugs and snails, which I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with. And of course, the message really is to make your garden more friendly to these creatures. And you know, if you don't have a pond, if you put a pond in, you're going to attract even more. And in that way, you're much more likely to be providing food for other creatures in the garden, which is a good thing. And the numbers and the potential damage to any of your garden plants will be a lot less. And I'm sure you wouldn't need to be using any pellets or anything like that to control them. So there's lots of birds that eat them: thrushes, blackbirds, redwings, fieldfares, robins, starlings, even things like ducks and chickens, hedgehogs, lots of amphibians, the frogs, newts and toads, ground beetles. So these are the big black beetles, which are really good at eating some of the smaller slugs. And there is a nematode worm which naturally occurs in the soil, but you can actually buy that as a bio friendly slug control, which is preferable to using anything actually poisonous. And then of course you yourself as the gardener, you can do quite a lot. So here's an example. If you do have precious plants that you want to obviously deter any problems from, there's lots of ways that you can do that without using poisonous pellets. So this was a little garden at Ryton called the Pest and Disease Control Garden, which was a demonstration garden set up to show different methods. So you've got little slug collars. There's things like grit and sawdust and bran, eggshells, lots of things that you can put around plants that, well, may or may not deter them, but you can but try. And there are pellets as well, which are not poisonous to other mammals. So there is a safe pellet if you really must go down that route, which I can tell you about if anyone wants to know, but it's the ferrous phosphate based pellet. So that would be a good idea. Okay. Another thing to note about your garden is you may actually be encouraging the very problems that you're trying to discourage, if you like. So in this picture here, it's the same patch of garden, but I redesigned it. So I used to garden with all this kind of planks and bed edging and having things in little rows and a nice little veg plot, which is all easy to look after. But of course, things like slugs and snails, they find lovely places to hide down the side of the planks. And, you know, from my, it's quite regimented. So on the one hand, it allows the gardener lots of control, but in fact, if you relinquish control, so I basically redesigned the garden to be much more, well, I suppose wildlife friendly, but also to include lots of other plants. So nectar producing plants, things like fennel, Californian poppies, lots of annual things like borage and so on, and then planted those amongst the veg. And basically I had a much prettier garden. I had much better biodiversity in the patch, and basically better protection for the plants altogether. So, you know, you can certainly change quite a lot in your garden to shift things to the advantage of the predators, so that they can help you keep things in balance. Okay. So that's what the garden looked like. So you can kind of spot there's some leeks in there, there's chard, but you can also see things like this is bronze fennel, there's cosmos growing in there and borage. all sorts of things. So, you know, that kind of cottage garden, much more mixed and varied, will give you better pest control amongst the veg, and definitely worth experimenting with. Okay. Oh yeah, why did I put this one in? Yeah, I'm a bit of a willow weaver. And this was, I put this in just to sort of show you something that I observed quite randomly, really. So I put in all this decorative bed edging just to be a bit decorative, and then I planted some kale plants along this bed at the back here. And the thing with kind of wildlife gardening, or, you know, is to be really observational in your garden. I mean, I don't know about you, but what I want in the garden is to go out there and listen to the birds and hear the bees buzzing and all the other insects, and to observe what's going on. And what I observed here was where I'd planted the kale, I didn't want to put a net over it, which is pretty ugly, although it would have solved the problem of the butterflies getting on there. What I actually found was, by having put the little hoops of willow, was the blue tits had a perfect little perch. So they would fly down at the same level of the kale, and they came in and just picked off the caterpillars for me. So, you know, maybe what you could think of doing is ways of just encouraging more wildlife in there, and to be able to actually access things. So rather than shoving nets over everything to keep things off, you know, maybe maybe the opposite might be just as effective. It's all trial and error. Okay, so just a few little facts and figures. So this is what we want to encourage, isn't it? We want lots of wonderful wildlife. And so if you do have a pond in the garden, bats do like hunting over water, especially, and they hunt lots of insects. So an adult bat will consume something like 3,000 insects in a night. So if you've eradicated all the insects in your garden, or your pests, then in fact you're really taking away the food for the predators. So here's another example. These are photos that I took of some roses in my garden. And I'm sure the picture on the left, we're very familiar with that, you know, early spring, masses and masses of aphids dropping on, or appearing seemingly overnight on all the nice new buds. And although you can effectively remove them without poisoning them or anything, you know, you can rub it over with your hand, or you can spray it off with some water. But in fact, if you do nothing and you've got some nice wildlife in your garden, what happened in my garden was 3 weeks later, that is exactly the same set of buds, and they were nice and clean and clear of aphids. So what's happened? Right. Basically, what we're looking at is what we call the balance of nature. So aphids are set up, if you like, well, there's different sorts of aphids. There are the adults that are the winged adults, are the ones that come in the spring. So they fly onto your plants and find them. And then they start laying eggs, and then the eggs hatch, and they hatch into these, again, all female aphids. And they're basically just baby machines, and they then give birth to live young. So within a week, they can really kind of colonize your plants very, very quickly, thousands and thousands of them. But of course, nature provides, doesn't it? So in fact, although there's thousands and thousands of aphids, if you don't panic and you sort of hang back, then it gives the predators a chance to come in. So this is, I'm sure you're all familiar with a ladybird, and you can see it's got an aphid in its mouth. The picture below there is the nymph of the ladybird. So first thing to sort of know is that a ladybird, it won't come and lay its eggs in your garden unless there are some aphids there already. So if you've gone in and eradicated everything, then the ladybird will go next door or somewhere else, because it wants to lay its eggs near where there's some food. So if you can hang back and let the ladybird lay its eggs, and then for their young to hatch out, the adult ladybirds eat about 50 aphids a day, and the nymphs will eat a similar amount. So that's 100 aphids a day being eaten by one single insect species there. And as well as the ladybirds, there's an awful lot of other creatures that are just there to eat in your garden. So
what they've said to her.
There's an example here. So if you've got a nest box in the garden, a nesting family of blue tits will consume about 600 caterpillars a day. So that's 10,000 in a season. The caterpillars that aren't taken by the birds can be supper for many other creatures too. And a lot of other creatures that you can attract to your garden are things like these parasitic wasps, and there are lots and lots of species of these. There's one that particularly parasitizes the cabbage white caterpillar, which is this one on the leaf. It's called a Pantales glomeratus, and what it does is it injects the caterpillar with its eggs, and the eggs hatch out and consume the caterpillar. So it's a bit of a gruesome death for the caterpillar, but it's nature's way of controlling it. So, you know, if you're a bird or a hedgehog or a hoverfly larvae, then basically the pests in the garden, although there's thousands and thousands, are lunch. And so, you know, the more that we can encourage this biodiversity, the more things will actually be kept under control. So what have we got here? So learn to recognize the friendly things in the garden. So we all know that spiders eat insects, so we kind of know that they're good. This is a garden spider. But how many of you knew that that wasps are also really good predators? And so early in the season, if when a queen is building the nest and the workers are hatching out, they will come buzzing around the garden and picking off really tiny caterpillars. So you imagine a wasp's mouth and what it can get in there. It can actually access some of the places where you're unlikely to find the caterpillars anyway, and it will take those back as protein for the young wasps. So wasps are definitely a plus in the garden early in the season anyway. And the earwig as well, they eat things like mites and so on. So a lot of creatures that look fairly threatening are actually really good predators. So these are the ground beetles. There's many different species of ground beetle, but they generally look like this. The black shiny ones that you find under leaf litter and so on. And they predate on all sorts of things. This is devil's coach horse. So lots of the creatures that you find in your compost heap are really good predators in the garden. Okay, what else have we got? So these are hoverflies. So there's also many insects which, as the adults, they are nectar feeders, but it is in fact their young in their sort of caterpillar phase, which are really good pest predators. So this is the hoverfly feeding on a chive flower, and this is the caterpillar, if you like, of the hoverfly, and that one is feeding on cabbage aphids. So you might well see that in the garden and think that that's a pest, but in fact that is a predator, and it's doing a good job of eating the aphids under the leaf there. I don't know if you can see there's an aphid here which is slightly bloated looking, and that has actually been parasitized by another of these tiny little parasitic wasps, and so there's one that's very specific even for aphids. This here is a lacewing, and again the young of the lacewing are really good pest predators. So that's why having lots of nectar-bearing plants in the garden and growing amongst the veg is really good to attract in the adults, and then the adults will find the best places to lay their eggs, and then you'll get this good natural control in the garden. So these are what these little parasitic wasps look like, not like the black and white, the black and yellow, sorry, wasps. And these are little nectar feeders. And if you grow things in the carrot family, such as fennel, I grow a bronze perennial fennel, which comes up every year. On my allotment, I tend to have a fennel plant on the end of every bed. And those umbellifer plants attract a lot of insects to the heads. They're very good for nectar bearing for these tiny little flies. So providing the right plants in your garden is the way to bring in these nectar feeders. This one down here is called a black-kneed capsid. And as you can see, it does actually have black knees. So I quite like those. And they feed on red spider mites, which cause a lot of damage to fruit trees. So really, I'm only showing you a tiny, tiny proportion of the massive biodiversity that the insect world holds of predators. And, you know, these parasitic ones, there's all sorts of ones which, you know, are kind of hunting predators. And really the best way to garden is just to kind of look after everything and provide lots of flowers and biodiversity and cover places for things to be. So these are some good nectar providing annual plants. This is the Californian poppy. Okay, it's not a native plant, but it attracts in these insects. There's another one here. This is called the poached eggplant, Limnanthes. And I grow that as a ground cover under fruit bushes and things because it comes up early in the spring, provides lots of nectar, and is really good at attracting these hoverflies. And this is the fennel plant, and that's just a hoverfly on a geum, I think. Yeah. Okay. So how am I doing for time, Katie? Are we all right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's fine, Sally. Thank you.
Okay. So well, I mean, here we are. We're a wildlife gardening group, so I'm sure you're all doing these things anyway. But we need lots of these things, don't we? So in order to sustain and increase existing wildlife in the garden, do all these good practices. So provide hibernation sites, so leave piles of leaves. You know, if you don't want them on the lawn, just push them under the hedge. You know, you don't have to sweep everything up and make it really, really tidy. Nest boxes, obviously. So if you can attract a family of blue tits into your garden, as we saw, that's 10,000 caterpillars less. And many, many other garden birds as well. And of course, look after them over the winter, which I'm sure, again, we're all doing. These are just little hollow tubes which you can make yourself out of either hollow plant stems or things like bamboo canes. And there's little solitary bees that'll put nests in those, and all sorts of other things will hibernate in them. So just create lots of places. A nice wood pile is another good thing. Okay, so so the next bit, yes, I suppose I'm going into fairly garden orientated stuff, but that's all good. We're talking about gardens. So as an organic gardener, the place where you start really is your soil. So the more that you put organic matter into the soil, you're actually creating a massive biodiversity in the soil that you never see. So the soil microorganisms actually feed many other creatures as well. So I mean, there's a ladybird, in fact, that feeds on fungal spores. You know, there's many microorganisms that feed on other microorganisms, and you know, they also feed on some of the pathogens, the disease organisms. So just having this, you know, really rich soil environment will improve that biodiversity that we don't even see. So composting, really important. I'm afraid I'm not a fan of these green bins that the council have that just take everything away. I firmly believe everyone should have a compost heap of some sort, even a small one that you can manage, and then put some of this material back into the soil, which will really help to feed things in the garden. So look after your soil is really number one. Okay. A good organic practice is to keep soil covered. Actually, bare soil is really bad. The rain washes through it in the winter, it washes out the nutrients. There's no places for creatures to hibernate over winter. So you can manage soil a lot better than just digging it over and leaving it bare in the winter. Actually, even just putting a covering of leaves over bare soil is better than leaving it completely bare. This is a green manure called tares, which you can see is covering the soil, but it's not stopping the vegetables from growing. But also some of the pests of things like cabbages, like the cabbage white butterfly, they actually identify the cabbage as somewhere to lay eggs on by randomly landing on leaves, and they taste through their feet. So if you kind of disguise the cabbages a little bit by growing other plants around them, you'll kind of confuse the pests a bit as well. So it's another reason for growing either nectar bearing plants around things, but you know, keeping the soil covered with something. So that's another useful thing to do. Right, so okay, this is again an organic gardening guidelines. So I used to work for Garden Organic, and they have these guidelines, which were I giving this talk in person, I would have examples with me and show them to you. But anyway, I can send a link to Katie, and we could, if anyone's interested, you can have these. So there's a whole lots of tips and ideas and things that are best, what we call best practice in organic gardening. So I've talked about soil care, keeping it covered, putting compost back on the soil and so on, and using things like manure and plant waste sparingly. So what happens when you put manure onto the soil, although it will make your plants grow bigger and better, it also makes them grow a little bit fast and quite soft and sappy, so that they're actually more tasty to slugs and aphids and some of these, well, so-called pests that we've been talking about. So you can actually manage the garden better, putting less of these materials on, and the plants will grow a little bit harder, and they'll produce their own protective agents as well to some of the pests. Okay, so I'll just go through these fairly quickly. These are just bits from the guidelines. So there's general tips about keeping the garden healthy. Always kind of number one is about keeping a biologically active soil, and as I've said, not leaving the soil bare and so on. So there's a whole list of really good practices to keep the garden healthy. And I guess what I mean by that is in effect having lots of biodiversity in it. So what you're aiming to do is to increase the biodiversity, not zap the pests in any way. So if that makes sense. So there we go. Grow a diversity of plants to provide food, shelter and habitats for predators, parasites and other wildlife. Leave some relaxed areas such as leaves under a hedge. There will always be pests present, but they don't always create a problem. So remember that they are a source of food for the predators and parasites and so on as well. And the more you can learn about the creatures in your garden, which ones are beneficial, which ones are predators and so on, then you're learning about that life cycle and the food chain of things. And really the message is, you know, you can more or less leave it alone. So do the things that bring in the good things. So this is basically never acceptable in an organic garden. So you can dump any of the poisons, which I'm sure none of you do anyway, but copper-based fungicides, any pesticide spray, and a lot of these sort of kitchen remedies are actually just as poisonous as something you can, you know, buy, and are not really recommended either. So, you know, don't start making up your own kitchen remedies either. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview on how to garden organically. So everything on the left-hand side is looking at healthy gardening. So you're feeding the soil, you're putting in healthy plants, encouraging biodiversity, sowing things from seed, and then making sure that your prevention is better than a cure. So if you've got things planted in the right place, they're not going to be under stress. And plants that are under stress are always targeted by pests first. So, so look after those. You can use plant protection, you can use repellents and all those things before you ever get into using any other pesticides, whether they're safe or not. Okay, I'll just whip over these. These are a bit garden specific. These ones. Oh, there we are. So that's my allotment. I started off with a lot of cardboard on it, and there it is, with some willow growing in there, but also I practice a no-dig method in the garden, and as I've mentioned, lots of flowers and so on to encourage biodiversity. So knowledge, observation and good information, really important, and really learn about what's going on in the garden. And our gardens are really important as a refuge for wildlife, supporting huge biodiversity, lots of plants and fungi, insects, molluscs, mammals and birds, and of course a refuge for us as well. So there we are. In summary, protect your precious plants, resist the urge to squash everything it may be on the menu today. Don't grow plants that are hard work. There are many trouble-free options to choose instead. Grow plants that attract predators. Make your garden wildlife friendly. Keep the soil mulched. Don't be too tidy. Have a compost heap and use compost. And remember, ladybirds need aphids. Okay. So there's some information there with the web address, Garden Organic, and as I mentioned before, the Garden Organic guidelines. So trial and error, let nature take the lead, and always go with your own garden, warts and all. So in my view, there are no garden pests, but we can argue that one and have a chat about that. There we go. Okay, so
Wow.
that's the end. Any questions?
Wow, Sally, that's brilliant. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Really inspiring. I love your carrots. Were they yours? Your amorous carrots.
My amorous carrots. I'm not sure where I got that picture from. I don't think they were mine, but
Oh, that's so good. Thank you. I just love that, working with nature and making it all harmonious and bringing it all together. It's just spot on. Thank you.
okay.
Yeah. I wonder, would you be able to stop screen share now?
Yeah.
Then we can see
Yeah.
if people want
Okay.
to ask a question.
So as long as everyone's not left.
No, they're still here.
They're all right. Still here.
And
Good.
Judy says, "Thank you, Sally. Great presentation," which it was. Thank you. Lovely. So
So you can use manure